All right, Donald. Well, I have got some data in front of me, which I think will help us to ground the conversation. And I think it's just really useful to look back on the last national and provincial elections in 2019. This is essentially a picture of the electoral map that you're seeing here. So what you see with the dark green, that's strong ANC support, so more than majority support. Light green is less than a majority. Less than an outright majority. And then the blue is the DA, and the red's not actually the EFF, but that's the IFP, which is very much centered in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think what's useful to note is that we have access to some polling data, which we provide to our clients. So the Center for Risk Analysis, we don't only do YouTube videos, we're also a policy think tank and an advisory unit that helps corporates and also increasingly individuals to understand the risks in South Africa and to help them navigate through some of the very tumultuous and uncertain times that we find ourselves in. So we actually have conducted extensive polling, and what you see here is really a breakdown of the ANC's electoral support in terms of various demographics. So, the way polling works is you'll have a demographically representative sample that's geographically dispersed across different age ranges, economic income brackets, and then also geographies. And I think what is quite startling with some of this data, and I mentioned this in that video that you were referring to, is that ANC support is based on a few key demographic groups, if you will. So not necessarily racial groups, but for example, as this slide shows here, the unemployed and people who are still seeking work, and also those who are not seeking work, tend to have disproportionately higher support for the ANC. That's kind of counterintuitive if you think about it, because we think that people who have been marginalized in the labor force, they have very little hope, very little opportunity.
They are the ones responsible for that.
Yeah, that they would see a kind of a causal link between the people who set policy in Pretoria and the availability or lack thereof of jobs in the jobs market. But, if you also consider that group of people, they tend to not have very much opportunity. They tend to be based in rural areas where the ANC has consolidated its power. It is very much aligned and connected to traditional leaders as well. At the provincial level also, the ANC has been able to dispense patronage to essentially buy loyalty from kind of local groups, traditional leaders being one of them, but also kind of local political barons. Also this group of people is dependent on the state for welfare. So we have another graph, which I haven't prepared here, but which shows the number of jobs since about 2008, and it's kind of flatlining like this. And the number of income grants, that's now up to about 18 million. Number of people with jobs is about 16 million. It's been hovering around there for the last 10 years or so. It hasn't really grown much, but the population has grown, and the number of income grants that are dispersed on an annual basis has grown to about 18 million. Some people get multiple income grants, but essentially got more people receiving grants than you have in work. And that has huge social ramifications in terms of it means that you're now dependent on the state to maintain yourself, to provide for the basic needs of yourself and your family. And it also means you're going to be a bit reluctant to vote against the political leaders who occupied the state.
Just for interest's sake, sorry, is there any other poll to compare this with? Like, for example, in 2019, 2018, like, did these numbers go up? For example, the unemployed still supporting the ANC?
We don't have that shown here, but maybe we should take a step back and just look at the overall electoral performance. So what I've shown here is the national election plus polling that was done by Ipsos, which is a very well-known, credible polling company, and then also some of the polling numbers that we have access to. And okay, so here we have the ANC's final tally of the votes, 57.5%. The Ipsos polling in November of that same year, 2019, showed a slight reduction in the ANC's majority. But come September 2020, after the full impact of the lockdown had been felt, you now see the ANC hovering very closely around that 50% mark. Compare that to the DA here in gray and the EFF in red. So our polling suggests pretty similar outcome to where the Ipsos polling was projecting the ANC. So remember, polling is also not a prediction of what the votes will be. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. So you should not necessarily project outwards. But, we've been doing this a long time, and this is the lowest that we've ever seen ANC support registering, both in the actual elections and in the polls. I mean, bear in mind that back in 2004, when Thabo Mbeki was at the height of his power, the ANC got nearly 70% of the vote. And at that time, the ANC was benefiting from the dividends of much more sensible economic policy. So for several years between about 2005 and 2007, we recorded GDP growth rates of north of 5% on average. We actually had a fiscal surplus. So that's the difference between government expenditure and revenue. And the government was actually collecting more than it was spending, which by contrast to today, it just seems like another planet. Today, we're spending about 14% more. That was at least in 2020. We've now had some increases in revenue because of the global commodities boom and the mining sector. They've been able to take advantage of that. So we're collecting more revenues, but still our deficit is hanging around 10%. And that's really not a sustainable position to be in. And when that commodity cycle turns, now we're going to be in quite a lot of trouble. And there's talk of a universal basic income grant being implemented as well, which would do much more harm to the tax base and which would put additional pressure on taxpayers as well. So this, I think, is a good comparison. And you could just, I think, you don't necessarily need to be a political scientist or a policy analyst to see the trajectory that the ANC is on. Also, something to bear in mind is that electoral data that the IEC releases shows that the number of people who are voting is also declining. The proportion of eligible voters has declined.
And that mainly affects the ANC, if I'm not mistaken, negatively.
Yeah, I mean, particularly at the local government elections, the opposition tends to benefit from what they call the differential turnout. People seem to be more likely to support the particular local candidate who might be from an opposition party than they would the national candidates. So that has impacted the ANC, but I mean, in some ways, also it's artificially inflated their support, because even though fewer people on aggregate are voting for the party, they still maintain the majority.